RGES World Literature. This is Lesson 32 on Les Miserables. We're going to be discussing this week Unit 3, which is all on Marius. It centers around him. Now, I've broken this into several sections. The first section is father and son. So let's reach for the highlights here. The father's name is Colonel Baron Pontmercy. He was a colonel in the army, fought for Napoleon, and Napoleon had given him this title. Now, the old rich in French society would have resented that. Okay, they're the ones that have been rich for decades, centuries, and it's something they're born into, their nobility. And so they would have resented this upstart, quote-unquote, nobility. But he married a noble woman, and she died, and she had a son, and the grandfather decided to raise the son, and if he raised him, of course he is with the royalists, and if he raised him, then he would inherit a quite a large fortune. He was very wealthy. Okay, he was a nobleman. Okay, but if the father insisted on taking the son and raising him, the son would be disinherited. So the father believes that this is a noble action to do. Whether we agree with it or not, he believes it's noble because in this way, the son will not suffer, only the father would. So we're going to look at a couple quotes, okay, on this. Let me write these ideas here. The first quote is about 3/4 of the way down on page 351, and it says, I think I'll do about the middle of that paragraph. However, in the society into which his grandfather took him, the whisperings, the hints, the winks, enlightened the little boy's mind at length. He finally comprehended something of it, and as he naturally imbibed, by a sort of infiltration and slow penetration, the ideas and opinions which formed, so to say, the air he breathed. In other words, he took in the ideas and attitudes of those around him. That would be the natural thing. He came little by little to think of his father only with shame and with a closed heart. So he is, when he hears his father spoken of, it's always with mockery or kind of implied snarly comments. And so he begins to feel his father must have been a very bad man. Okay. And so he takes in the attitude of those who are raising him. Now on the next page, 352, towards the end, we'll look at one more idea about Marius and his relationship to his father. It says, Marius Pontmercy went, like all children, through various studies. When he left the hands of Aunt Guillenomon, his grandfather entrusted him to a worthy professor of the purest classic innocence. This young, unfolding soul passed from a prude to a pedant. Marius had his years at college, then he entered the law school. He was royalist, fanatical, and austere. He had little love for his grandfather, whose gaiety and cynicism wounded him, and the place of his father was a dark void. For the rest, he was an ardent but cool lad, noble, generous, proud, religious, lofty, honorable even to harshness, and pure even to unsociableness. So this speaks to Marius's character, but it also shows that his father left a void in his heart. So that forms our background, and now what happens? His father dies, he gets a telegram, he's supposed to show up and visit his dying father. He's reluctant to do it. This man is a nobody in his life. He has no relationship with him, nor any regard for him. But he finally kind of stalls a little. He goes and realizes that the father had died waiting for him. And he comes in on this scene, okay, where others are mourning for his father. His father has just died. His father has a tear on his face that he has missed his son and has had to die before he's met with him. But he had also left him a letter, and so on page 355, we have the letter that Marius's father, the Colonel Baron Pontmercy, leaves for his son. And we get a whole other picture. The letter goes like this. For my son, the emperor made me a baron upon the battlefield of Waterloo. Since the Restoration contests this title, which I have bought with my blood, my son will take it and bear it. I need not say that he will be worthy of it. On the back the colonel had added, at this same Battle of Waterloo, a sergeant saved my life. This man's name is Thénardier. Not long ago, I believe he was keeping a little tavern in a village in the suburbs of Paris at Chelles or at Montfermeil. If my son meets him, he will do Thénardier all the service he can. So here is a letter from the father that has died without any reconciliation, and Marius realizes that what he's been told about his father is false. Now he realizes that because he had seen his whole view of his father was shaped by those around him, and when he went to Mass, he ran into the church warden who told him all about this very noble man who kept coming every time he knew his little boy would be brought into church, so he could gaze upon him, and never had he known somebody to love his child so well. So he has a total change of attitude towards his father. And with that comes a total change in attitude towards politics. He becomes an ardent Bonapartist. He even has cards made up. So the two things that his father had asked him in the letter was he's to take his title, so well earned, baron, and to do good to the man who rescued him on the battlefield, Thénardier. And will you recall that story, hopefully, from the previous section? Recall that he was actually trying to pilfer through the pockets of the dead when Pontmercy revives, and then he acts as though he were saving him. So when Marius comes back, it's obvious that he is very moody and withdrawn, and they think, oh, maybe it's just a young love crush or whatever. But instead, there is this big conflict between the two. Now, before we get into that, I'm going to, the name of the grandfather is Monsieur Gillenormand. And it says on page 360, let's look at that quote. By another natural consequence, in proportion as he drew nearer to his father, his memory, and the things for which the colonel had fought for 25 years, he drew away from his grandfather. As we have mentioned for a long time, Monsieur Gillenormand's capriciousness, so he's a kind of a moody and unpredictable man, seems to do things without a steadiness, had been disagreeable to him. There was already between them all the distaste of a serious young man for a frivolous old man. So that's the way that Marius had already been viewing his grandfather even before this death of his father occurred. Now we have a defining moment on page 362 and 363. We have two proud men with self-righteous attitudes coming to loggerheads. In the middle of this quarrel, Marius says, "It means that I am my father's son." And of course, the grandfather who has raised him all his life was angry, and he said, "Your father? I am your father." And then Marius responds with dignity about his own father, resenting the fact that he'd been kept from them. They go from bad to worse, and finally, Gillenormand kicks his grandson out of the home. Okay. He says, "A baron like monsieur and a bourgeois like me cannot remain under the same roof," probably hoping his grandson would relent and soften, but instead he did not. Two proud men. He stopped away, and Gillenormand says, "You will send 60 pistoles every 6 months to this blood drinker," referring to how cruelly he's treated him, "and never speak of him to me again," caring enough to provide for him, but too proud to back up. Now, it says a little later, he regretted that he was so well obeyed. He would have loved somebody else to break the ice, but he could not do it, and nor could the grandson. Now, a beautiful quote on page 390 and 391. It says, "Marius was now 20 years old. It was 3 years since he had left his grandfather. They remained on the same terms on both sides without attempting a reconciliation and without seeking to meet. And indeed, what was the use of meeting? To come in conflict, which would have had the best of it. Marius was a vase of brass, but Monsieur Gillenormand was an iron pot." It goes on to tell the truth. Marius was mistaken as to his grandfather's heart. He imagined that Monsieur Gillenormand had never loved him, and that this crusty and harsh yet smiling old man, who swore, screamed, stormed, and lifted his cane, felt for him at most only the affection at once slight and severe of the old men of comedy. Marius was deceived. There are fathers who do not love their children. There is no grandfather who does not adore his grandson. In reality, we have said, Monsieur Gillenormand worshipped Marius. He worshipped him in his own way, with an accompaniment of cuffs and even of blows, but when the child was gone, he felt a dark void in his heart. He ordered that nobody should speak of him again, and regretted that he was so well obeyed. So this is interesting, isn't it? Just because of the way people act on the surface does not necessarily reflect, in fact, often does not reflect what's going on in their hearts. So we have to be very careful when we are evaluating another person. Okay? We don't want to judge them too harshly. We all need actually a lot more compassion than we often give one another. And often our true hearts, the deepest part of our hearts, lay hidden from one another. So be very careful with that. Learn to be a person that would try to draw out the heart of another. And that's sometimes hard to do because we're proud. And we are more about defending our own selves and our own pride and hurt than we are about reaching out for the other person. And I certainly have been guilty of that many times myself. So the quote I'd like you to put in there is, Marius was deceived. He was mistaken as to his grandfather's heart. He goes on the top of the next page. However strong his nature might be, the absence of Marius had changed something in him, for nothing in the world would he have taken a step towards that little rogue. In other words, he was too proud to be the one to bring reconciliation, but he suffered. He never inquired after him, but he thought of him constantly. He lived more and more retired in the Marais. So it's kind of a sad story, isn't it? This breach of relationship. So let's go on now to a third section, the Friends of the ABC. Now this third group, or this third section, the Friends of the ABC, is really a pun on the letters ABC, so that's how they're known, but they take it from a French word meaning, which is pronounced the same way, ABC, and that means the abased. We could actually have the synonym, the misérable. Okay, so they are a revolutionary group. This is after the downfall of Napoleon, and we're in the restoration of the king, and they still want to push towards democracy, right? And liberty. So there's three main characters that I think you should know their names and what they really represent for the group. Enjolras represents the logic. He's the chief. He's the thinker, okay, on what they need to do. Combeferre is the philosopher, and he's their guide. And Courfeyrac is the center, meaning he's not so much the head or the thoughtful of this revolution, but he is the heart of it, the passion of it. He's the one who feels it and can express it. So this is a rather extensive look at this. You can refer to page 368 and 369, but do know these men at least to that degree. Now, this group that befriends and takes Marius under their wings, remember, he's thrown out into the street. He's a rich young man. He's not used to really keeping himself, having any job that he can sell, that kind of thing. He has studied law, but he's far from being able to make a living at that. And they take him under, they make sure he's got a place to stay, food, but they challenge his new faith. This would be his perspective. Napoleon was like a god now to him, okay, because his father fought for him, so he must be. And these men see the strengths of the revolution that had come before, but also its weaknesses, or at least some of them. They have some insight into that, and they have some criticism for Bonaparte as well. And so the key in this we're looking at, this book looks at a lot of different angles. It looks at society, it looks at the politics, and it also looks at the individuals. And on the individual side, what's happening to Marius because of this? Because he's so uncomfortable with them challenging his newfound perspective, he is isolated. He withdraws from them and becomes isolated. Now, that's a dangerous place to be, okay? When you are, he's already been isolated from his grandfather. He's isolated and feels like it's robbed his relationship with his father because he doesn't get to know things until too late. And so he plunges at this point, we're talking about now Marius, plunges into poverty in even a more radical way. In the meantime, he's so proud that when the money is sent from his grandfather, he always refuses it. Okay? But he plunges into poverty, and he is isolated. And slowly by slowly, he begins to climb out of this by being a translator and that kind of thing. And he moves in to the old Gerbeau house. Now that's something that you should have known from before. Jean Valjean and Cassette had lived there. And now another person is living there also. So in the past, Jean Valjean had lived there, and now even at the same time he is living there, he becomes neighbors to another family, and that is the Thénardiers. Now they go under a new name now, and they have also had a great deal of decrease in or plunging more and more into poverty. Now our next section is where he falls in love with Cosette. Now a few years earlier, when he had first left his grandfather, he used to walk in the Luxembourg Gardens, and he noticed this old man with white hair and this young girl, and he noticed them sitting on the park bench as he would walk by on his route every day, but he thought nothing of it. Now 3 years have passed, and let's pick up their quote on page 398. It says he went straight to, quote, his walk, and as soon as he reached it, he saw, still on the same bench, this well-known pair. When he came near them, however, he saw that it was indeed the same man, but it seemed to him that it was no longer the same girl. The woman whom he now saw was a tall, beautiful creature with all the most bewitching outlines of woman at the precise moment at which they are yet combined with all the most charming graces of childhood, that pure and fleeting moment which can only be translated by these two words, sweet 15. And so what happens is she is grown into a woman, and now all of a sudden he notices her with totally new eyes. It goes on the next page to say, in 6 months the little girl had become a young woman. That was all. Nothing is more frequent than this phenomenon. There is a moment when girls bloom out in a twinkling and become roses all at once. Yesterday we left them children. Today we find them dangerous. Now what does that mean, we find them dangerous? Gentlemen in the class, you might want to answer. Or maybe you're glad you're not in the class right now to answer this. What does that mean? It means they can arrest your heart. Love is an interesting thing. Love can arrest the heart in a moment, which is why it really is very important that we guard our hearts. Okay, but in love, sometimes it happens just like that, almost like a light bulb switching. And we have to be very careful in those moments because we can respond in a very strong way. It can be delicious, it can be delightful, or it can be very dangerous for both partners, both the man or the young man and the young woman. So be very careful. So he says dangerous, right? We find them dangerous. So what ensues now in the novel is actually, I think, a very fun part of the book as he describes that Marius falling desperately in love. Later we learn that she is also responding. They're responding to one another, but right now we know that he is desperately in love. He walks by every day, he gets new clothes, he pays attention and brushes his hat, he wears some gloves, he's totally preoccupied with this. Not a hugely uncommon condition, okay? To be that preoccupied as you fall in first love. Okay, so he finds a handkerchief. This handkerchief comes into play a little later, but on it is the initials embroidered, UF. So he imagines, who could this young lady be? She's wonderful, she's stolen my heart, who could she be? And he decides that her name must be Ursula. So he worships her from afar as his Ursula. He calls the old man Monsieur Leblanc. Leblanc means white, the white one, because his hair is so white. So Monsieur Leblanc and Ursula. Well, they pass a little bit of time where each day they're looking a little more at each other. They try to catch each other's eyes. They might even walk. He might walk by to get her attention and turn around and walk by the other way. And all this quote-unquote, seemingly innocent flirtation as they're trying to get each other's attention. This is all occurring at the Luxembourg Gardens, and the old man does notice, becomes alarmed, becomes threatened, and moves away. And right as he's feeling like he's beginning, he looks at him as an enemy because they're trying to do all this, quote unquote, behind his back. They're not doing anything but just looking at each other and catching each other's attention. But then very suddenly, they're gone. And he plunges him into despair and depression because he has no idea her name, he has no idea where they live or anything about them. How will he ever see her again? Actually, I misspoke the detail there. He does know where they live, and he's followed them and hangs out outside, and then in a couple of days, they have moved away, and he does not know how to find them.